we've been talking about the scientific view of where the universe comes from. We've seen that the Big Bang Theory, there's some problems with the Big Bang Theory, and the idea that the whole universe can appear out of nothing really doesn't make a great deal of sense. So what I'd like to do now is to talk about the Vedic concept of the structure of the universe, not in terms of astronomy, but in terms of the essential elements of the universe. When I was at school learning chemistry, when it got to the point of learning about the elements, chemical elements, first of all the chemistry teacher said, well, in the old days, the alchemists, they believed in earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Well, now we know that they're not really elements at all. Earth is a mixture of substances. Water is a compound with some other compounds in it. Air is a mixture of some elements and some compounds like carbon dioxide. Fire is a whole dynamic region of chemical reactions, and ether probably doesn't exist. So what did the ancients know? What did the alchemists know? And then he went on to explain about chemical elements. So the real elements that make up this world: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and so on. Later on, I realized that these aren't actually elements, in the sense that they're not elements of our existence. Now, I can see some aluminium right now, but, for example, we don't see carbon, usually. You don't see hydrogen in everyday existence. When was the last time that you used sodium, or phosphorus, or fluorine, or chlorine? These are conceptually the parts, like they seem to be the building bricks of our world, but actually they're artificial substances in the sense that they've been isolated from the world of everyday experience by artificial processes, very, very energetic processes. Like, for example, to get aluminium, you have to electrolyze a concentrated ore of aluminium with very high electric current. And sodium is even more difficult to get. Fluorine, and once you get fluorine, it'll combine with anything in sight unless you keep it isolated. So they're actually artificial substances created by artificial arrangements. So in that sense, they're not really elements of our everyday experience. Another point is that the transuranic elements, we have the very heavy elements, uranium, radium. So the elements which are even heavier, they're very, very unstable, but they're still elements. They're still chemical elements. Some of them, for example, one of them, only one atom has ever been created, and it lasted for a zillionth of a second and then decomposed. But that's still a chemical element. It's not an element of our everyday existence. And not only that, but the elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, they can all be broken down further. Protons, neutrons, electrons, and going on down, quarks and leptons, all sorts of things. So they're not really irreducible elements. So in order to find the irreducible elements, then we've got to come back and look at the world as it really is. Supposing, for example, we think about James Watt. He's in his laboratory and he's making steam engines. So what does he need? He needs an iron vessel, vessel, piston. Actually, it doesn't have to be iron, but it needs to be solid. He could make it out of porcelain if he wanted. It's got to be solid anyway. Inside that, he needs water. It didn't even have to be water, it could be alcohol, but it has to be liquid, which can be gasified by applying heat. So that's the third thing, energy. He needs fire. It wouldn't have to be fire, you could use an electric immersion heater, but there's got to be energy there. And the energy has got to turn the liquid into gas, and then the parts of the engine have got to move. And then finally all of this has got to be within space, accommodating space. So the real elements that he needs are solidity, liquidity, energy, movement, and accommodating space. Those are the elements. And those are actually irreducible. For example, supposing we talk about solidity. Well, scientists will say, well, solidity comes out because of the nature of the atom. But if you look at the atom, you find that the atom has self-dependent form. It's got its own form. That means it's solid. It's also fluid, because otherwise it can't combine with other atoms. So fluidity is also built into the atomic concept. Within the atom, there's energy, E equals mc squared, we know. Then there's movement also. If we think in the classical sense, and the protons are moving about, electrons are moving about the protons and neutrons. In any case, whether you look at it from the classical sense or the quantum mechanical sense, there's movement there, and it all takes place in space. So even built in within the atom, there's these 5 concepts: solidity, fluidity, energy, movement, and space. So these are actual irreducible elements of our world of experience. And really, I mean, if you look around you, you won't find anything outside of those things. Now, the Vedas, the Vedic concept is that they denote solidity by earth. They say that, so when the Vedas talk about earth, bhumi, it's actually talking about that, the element that has that function, solidity, self-dependent form. Fluidity, the classic fluid element, that's water. So when the Vedas talk about water as being an element, they're really referring not to substance, but to function. If we read in Srimad Bhagavatam, for example, Lord Kapila's instructions on the makeup of material nature, he explains with every element, he's explaining this is not substance, it's function. Fire, we're talking about energy. We're not talking about the substance, what's going on there. Similarly, when it's talking about air as being an element, it's not talking about the gases, oxygen and nitrogen. It's talking about movement. The essential function of air is movement. And the essential function of ether, akash, that's accommodation. So actually the Vedic concept of the 5 elements ties in exactly with the old alchemical idea. In other words, the alchemists, because we don't know whether they were thinking of these elements in the ancient Vedic sense, or whether their conception had become degraded. But anyway, they're drawing on the ancient wisdom, which has been lost in modern society. So the Vedic concept of elements, these 5 gross elements, is very, very it's consistent and it's self-consistent. But it goes further, because when we look at how do we know about form? How do we know about solids? How do we know about liquids? How do we know about movement? How do we know about space? There are objects of the senses. They're not the most fundamental elements of our experience. The most fundamental elements of our experience are the objects of the senses: form and colour, sound, touch, taste, and smell. And these are also irreducible. And you can't get more kind of basic than that. Especially from the point of view of empirical science. Empirical science is the science of experience. So we're experiencing directly the world of solid and liquid and so on. But ultimately we're experiencing form, touch, taste, smell and sound. You can't get more basic than that. These are the ultimately irreducible elements of our experience. But then there's something else that we have to consider. In order to perceive form and colour, we need the faculty of vision, sight. In order to perceive sound, we need the faculty of hearing. So the 5 sense faculties, they're also fundamental irreducible elements. Although the physical structure, for example, of the ear, or the physical structure of the eye, that we can discuss. But the fact of perception, the fact of hearing, it's an irreducible part of our experience. You can't say that it's built up of any other more fundamental. Supposing you say, well, it's built up of neurons to the brain. But when you talk about neurons to the brain, you're building sight into that already. You have to describe it in terms of what you can see. Perception is there. So perception is basic. So these are 15 elements. There's the 5 gross elements: solid, liquid, energy, movement, and space. Then there's the 5 sense objects, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge. And then the other irreducible aspects of our experience is the way that we act on the world. We've already said that purposeful activity it's self-evident and it's self-validating as well. Science is based on purposeful activity. So there's different kinds of purposeful activity. Specifically, manipulation. We use our hands to move things around. We use our legs, or whatever, some form of transport, to move our bodies around. And we use the power of speech, or maybe symbolic representation of speech, like printed word, to communicate. And then there are two other elements that the Vedas mention. That's use of the genital and use of the rectum. Now, you could say, well, those aren't really essential aspects of science, because you could be celibate and constipated and still do science. But...
And maybe many of them are.
But if you think of the power of insemination, like we talk about seminal ideas. So if you think about the power of insemination, then that's actually essential to science. And also the power of getting rid of all the crap, getting rid of all the old stuff that we don't need. That's what excretion is also very, very important. Getting rid of the old theories and ideas, like scientism, for example. So anyway, I'll pass on those two. But at least we can see that the different aspects of purposeful activity, they're also essential elements in our experience of the world, in our interaction with the world. Then there's the mind. Mind is engaged in accepting and rejecting mental forms, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and so on. So that's also an essential part of the scientific process, and you can't reduce it, because once you start trying to understand whatever's more basic than the mind, you still have to use the mind. The mind is built into it. So it's self-evident and it's self-validating. It's an irreducible element. In order to do good science, you have to know how to use your mind. Some things are attractive, some things are not so attractive, but we have to train the mind to go in the right direction, and that requires something called intelligence, buddhi. Buddhi is the faculty of guiding the mind in the right direction. For example, a child will see a razor blade and think, well, that's nice because it's shiny. But an adult whose intelligence, buddhi, is more developed will say, no, this is dangerous. You have this and give them something. It doesn't look so attractive, but it's more beneficial. Similarly, a scientist has to know what direction to go with his investigation. That requires intelligence. Then the conscious self. This is also an element. This is one of the elements. The conscious self that directs the perception, the activities, directs the mind, directs the intelligence. Another element of existence, although theoretically we can understand that we're conscious self, the self is not changing. The I-ness, the self-ness, is not changing. Even though the world is changing, our body is changing, our mind is changing, my conception of life, my ideas, my personality, it's all changing, but my I-ness doesn't change. So the I-ness is not subject to change in time, whereas everything else is. In other words, it's not material. But yet, I consistently think that I'm part of this material world. I consistently depend on things in this material world, although actually this world of changing matter, inert matter, can't really satisfy the eternal conscious self. So there's another element called false ego, ahankar, which makes us think that we're part of this material world. It makes us identify with the material world. This is also an element of the material world according to Vedic philosophy and understanding. And then we have the universal self, Paramatma, or the super soul. This is also an essential ingredient. Super soul, or the universal self, is the basis of everything that goes on in the world, including our existence, the way that we interact with the world, the makeup of the world, and everything. So these, according to the Vedic point of view, these are the actual ingredients of material existence. The universal conscious self It's the basis of the existence of the individual, all of the individuals. And it's also the basis of the communication and community between the individuals. Ecological communities, psychological communities, social communities, relationships and everything. And also it's the basis of the whole physical makeup, the physical laws, how the universe works, how the physical universe works. These are three functions of the universal self, which are also essential parts of science and they're essential parts of life. So they're self-evident and they're also self-validating, because if you talk about them, those elements themselves are involved in the discussion. According to modern mathematicians, especially after Einstein says that the world exists in a continuum of time and space. It looks as though, he's saying that from our point of view, it looks as though time and space are distinct, but actually time and space form a continuum, and the world exists in a four-dimensional continuum of time-space. The Vedic concept of time is different. Time is known by change. So, for example, at some point we have to think that the world appeared. I mean, for example, in the Big Bang Theory they say like that. And in the Vedic concept also they say like that the world appeared. That is a change, and it takes place in time. Time and space are not actually equivalent. For example, if I move around in space, it takes time, but it doesn't take space necessarily to move around in time. We have to change. We're forced to change in time, but we're not forced to change in space. So they're really not equivalent. Mathematically, they may be equivalent. Now, the scientists say, well, if it's mathematical, it must be true. But that itself is not true. There's one mathematician, Sir Herbert Dingle, and he says, in the language of mathematics, we can tell lies as well as truths. And within the scope of mathematics itself, there's no possible way of telling one from the other. We can only distinguish them by experience or by reasoning outside the mathematics, applied to the possible relationship between the mathematical solution and its physical correlate. In other words, what you say mathematically, it may be true in the physical world or it may not. The fact that it's mathematically valid doesn't guarantee that it relates to real events in this physical world. So the fact that mathematically time and space form a continuum doesn't mean to say that they're actually of similar nature in the material world, in the physical world of everyday experience. Time is known as the mixing element. So we see that actually, if we consider the elements, the gross elements, there's a succession from subtle to gross. First of all, you have space. Space is very, very subtle. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, but you can hear about it. We can talk about space. If I say there's a certain amount of space between you and me, I'm talking about it and we can agree on that. But that's the only sense object that has any relationship with space. Motion, you can feel motion, touch. So that's the next from space, then air, motion. And then energy. And then liquidity, and then solidity. So there's a progression from subtle to gross. And according to the Vedic concept, when the universe manifests, it manifests in that order. The first, from the subtle material energy in its unmanifest state, then by the action of time, you come to manifest material energy, which hasn't yet actually produced the elements. It's practically inconceivable. Then from that, sound comes. So there is a correlate between the Big Bang and the Vedic theory, because according to the Vedic theory, the first element to appear is sound. We don't know what sound, but that's... Then from sound comes space. From sound and the faculty of hearing, then comes space. Then from space comes movement. From movement comes energy. From energy comes liquid. From liquid comes solid. Now the interesting thing is that if mathematically, if you take space and then you introduce time into space, then you get what's called a change of a change of distance with time. That's movement. Well, movement is the second element. So according to the Vedic conception, by the mixing of time in space, you get motion. And mathematically, that's actually what happens. Now, if you've got something moving at a steady rate, in order to change its motion, you have to apply some energy. It takes some energy. So according to the Vedic conception, when you introduce time into motion, air, you get fire, which is energy. So there's a very interesting correlation between the actual mathematical identity of these elements and the succession with the introduction of time into them. So according to the Vedic concept, all of the elements, they're energies of the Supreme Self. And I'd just like to quote from Arthur Young. I mentioned him before. He invented the Bell helicopter. Very, very intelligent scientific person. He's written a book called The Reflexive Universe. So he has something. He's a very practical person, and he also has a practical attitude to science. So he says the physical universe has its source in and is derived from a prior or transcendent unity, a primordial unity or first cause, essentially non-material and spiritual in nature. First cause is immanent as well as transcendent. This is a very nice point. What he's saying is that immanent means that it's within the universe and it's involved in the working of the universe. And transcendent means it's beyond the universe as well. So what Young is saying completely corresponds to the Vedic concept that the first cause is transcendent, means Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality in his own abode. I mean, we're talking about Allah, Jehovah, Krishna, Govinda, of the different theistic religions. But also, he's involved in the way he expands himself, and he's present in the universe as the universal self, Paramatma, Supersoul, whatever word we use. So Jung's teaching on that exactly corresponds with the Vedic worldview as well. He says it's ever the nature of the first cause that it is completely without limitation, without qualification, and it has nothing before it. No matter how vast our finite knowledge is, it can never circumscribe that which is infinite. This Vedic worldview, then, it's consistent. It's consistent with known facts. It's consistent with the structure, the texture, the nature of existence as we perceive it and as we're involved in it. It's dynamic. You don't have to cut anything out. The Vedic view doesn't cut anything out. It's completely inclusive. They don't, for the sake of convenience, remove the conscious observer from what's going on. And they don't remove the idea of a first cause either. So it's consistent with known facts, and also it's self-consistent, because it includes the conscious personality who has knowledge and is striving for more knowledge, and it also includes the universal conscious coordinating factor, which is the basis of everything else that's going on in the universe. So it's self-referring, it's reflexive, it's very consistent system of knowledge. And also, one final point, I'll go on to talk about the conditions for scientific knowledge, consistent scientific knowledge. So one thing is that our explanations of the world have to correspond to our descriptions. Explanations have to correspond to descriptions. So broadly we can say that in the Vedic worldview, we understand from our own direct experience that our worldview exists in our consciousness. It depends on consciousness, fundamentally. Consciousness is the prime reality. Scientists also agree with that, or scientific philosophers or philosophical scientists. Consciousness is the first reality, and within that consciousness is our understanding and perception of the world. So, if you're going to have a consistent worldview based on that, then your worldview, you have to take consciousness as the prime reality and matter depending on consciousness, which of course the Vedic worldview does do that, and the mechanistic worldview doesn't do that. So the Vedic worldview is very consequent, very consistent in this way. So we put it forward that on the one hand it's a very simple, a beautifully simple and consistent way of ordering our understanding of how the world works. And at the same time, it's very practical because it tells us how we can organize our knowledge, what should be the real goal of knowledge, and how we can work within the world.
Question. It's not clear to me how super self, paramatma, super soul, super consciousness, whatever the binding principle is self-evident and self-consistent.
Okay.
Could you expound on self-validating?
Yeah.
Expound on that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the question arises that how can we say that the universal self is self-consistent? Self-evident and self-validating. It's subtle, obviously. First of all, I exist. I am an irreducible, undeniable element of my experience of the world because I'm organizing my perceptions and everything. As such, there's no physical explanation for my existence. I can't say that anything in the world of my experience has given rise to me. That's not possible. So we have to look for another explanation because not only I exist, you exist, the myriads of living entities all exist, all of them physically inexplicable. So there must be some other explanation. That what is it that's maintaining my existence? What's maintaining your existence? What's maintaining your existence? It's like a fountain. You see so many fountains playing, so you know there's some force behind the fountain. So we're like conscious fountains. There's some force which is keeping those fountains playing. What is it? It's a subjective force. I am a subject. So there must be some universal subject which is manifesting all the individual subjects and maintaining their existence and function. In this way, the universal self is self-evident. Second thing is, not only are we individual conscious entities whose existence doesn't depend on the matter of which we are conscious, but also we can communicate with each other, we can commune with each other, we can have communion on a very, very deep level. We can have loving relationships on a material level. We can have very deep psychological relationships, and we can have spiritual relationships. Spiritual love. If two people have a very deep relationship with the Supreme Personality, they can also have a very deep relationship with each other. So that relatedness of all the individual conscious selves is also, it's an essential part of science. It's an essential part of our life. And it's self-evident. But so we have to see that there's something which is producing that. There's a matrix, there's a basis for that. That is also the universal conscious self. Last thing, there's the world of matter. Now, I explained before that if it takes intelligence to understand matter, well, it must take the same intelligence to maintain matter, but universally. At least that much intelligence. And the more intelligence you use, the more intelligence and force you use to wonder at the consistency of material energy, like subatomic consistency, for example. So that same ability to wield energy in a consistent way must also be there in the basis of matter. So these three aspects, and they're not only these three aspects of the universal self, they're not only self-evident, but they're also an essential part of our performance of the, in particular, scientific process, but in general, our process of living in the material world, communicating with each other and advancing in terms of managing matter and also improving our knowledge, our understanding, ultimately our realization of the goal of life. So, because they're an essential part of that, they can't be denied. Because if you start talking about them, they're part of the discussion automatically. It means they're self-validating. They appear even in the denial of their existence and nature. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.